It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Gigabyte M27U. The OSD is controlled by a little joystick at the rear of the monitor towards the right side, and there's also a KVM switch, dedicated KVM button above that, and I'll come on to that shortly. If you move the joystick in any direction before you've actually pressed it, then you can activate the quick switch functionality, and you can configure that in the main OSD in System, Quick Switch. So there's up, down, right and left, so you can configure what happens if you just press up on its own. There's aim stabilizer, sync, black equalizer, low blue light, volume, input, contrast, brightness and picture mode. And you can do the same for down, left and right as well as up. So if I press up, you can see I can configure the picture mode, and I'll come on to these when I get to them in the main menu system. Left allows me to quickly adjust the volume as I've got it configured at the moment. Right also allows me to adjust the picture mode. Of course I could have had something else selected there. And down allows me to quickly adjust the brightness. If you press the joystick, you get this little quick menu. So the top option there, I know this might be quite difficult to see because it's quite small because of the pixel density of the monitor. So up is setting, right is game assist, down is power off, and left is KVM Multitask. So I'll just start off with the KVM Multitask function. So this monitor does have KVM functionality. That means you can quickly switch between multiple systems or assign your USB peripherals to multiple systems, as well as quickly switching the display input. So you can see it's configured here with KVM Wizard, and it's set up at the moment so that the USB-B upstream port, that's what it shows there, is controlling something connected via HDMI port 1, and the device connected by USB-C will have USB Type-C for the upstream capability. But as you can see, you can change that. And if you press the button on the monitor when you're not in the main menu system, the KVM button, then it will switch between these. So I can switch between a system connected via DisplayPort with USB-B and a system connected via USB-C for the display input and for the data transfer. If you don't want to use the KVM functionality and you don't want to accidentally press the KVM button because it will try and switch inputs and you might not want to if you don't even have anything else connected to it, then you can select KVM off there, and there's KVM reset, which will just reset all of this to the factory defaults. Next I'll go through Game Assist. That's always a fun one to take a quick look at. And again, I'm sorry if this is difficult to see, just because of how they've done it, it's quite blended and small, but I'll try to go through it anyway. So first of all, I'm just going to change the dashboard location. So there's game info, there's a timer feature, a counter feature and refresh rate. So the timer, it can count up or count down. I'm just going to turn them all on at the same time just to briefly go through what they do, and the refresh rate display. So you can have one of these, you can have two of these or three of these active depending on what you want. And you can change the info location. So I'm just going to have it there so you can actually see it on the video, because it was actually out of shot just before in the top right. But you can see you can have it in the top right, the center right region, bottom right, and the same on the left side. So now you can see that my little timer thing is counting up. The thing below that will count how many times you press certain buttons, and you have to configure that in Sidekick. It used to be called OSD Sidekick, but it's now just called Sidekick, I believe. It's part of Gigabyte Control Center now, and I will show you that towards the end of the video. And if you prefer, you can have that timer counting down. So I can have it counting down from 5 minutes, for example. And just to give you a quick idea of what that FPS counter does, if you're using VRR, so using G-Sync compatible or AMD FreeSync, for example, then that will shift in accordance with the frame rate of the content. If you're not using VRR, then it won't do that. So you can see it's changing as my frame rate is changing all over the place with the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. And it shows the frame rate within the VRR range, or the refresh rate of the monitor. So if it's below the normal floor of operation, so I've just selected 35 frames a second for the content, it doubles that and it shows 70 frames a second, because it's using LFC, low frame rate compensation, as explored in the review. Yes, there's a little bit of fluctuation either side, but that's just because of how the demo works. There's a crosshair feature. So there's style 1, which is a standard style, a green cross. Difficult to see with this wallpaper. And that one. Yeah, it's a bit clearer. It's a little green cross in the middle there. If you prefer, you can customize this using the Sidekick software. And I know I said I was going to show you the Sidekick software at the end, and I will go through it properly at the end, but I'm just going to quickly open it up just so I can show you this feature on its own as it's relevant to this section. Yeah, sometimes it says in great English, no device finded when you open Gigabyte Control Center, but it will find your monitor, or it should find your monitor eventually. So under Game Assistant, or in-game assistant, it has Crosshair here, so I can turn it on. Style 1, Custom 1, Custom 2, Custom 3. So if I press Edit there, when I've got one of the custom ones selected, you can see that little pen icon is available. It allows me to draw a crosshair. You can have a small or large design, different colour. So the whole thing is one colour, you can't select multiple colours at the same time. Also be aware that this is always going to be in the central region of the screen. You can't customise the position of the crosshair. It'll become clear if I press Save here, and this will upload it to the monitor. Takes a little bit of time. And you can now see my design in the middle there, and it's always in the center as shown there. And since I have Gigabyte Control Center and Sidekick running, I might as well show you the dashboard feature. So that just gives you some information on the screen. You can see at the top left there. I'm just going to shift the dashboard location so it's easy to see. Actually, I don't know if that is easy to see, but I've shifted it to the right anyway, and you'll see there's nothing there at the moment. You have to make sure this is actually set to on, and then you can select what you want it to show. So there's CPU temperature, frequency, fan speed, usage rate, GPU temperature, frequency, fan speed, usage rate, and Aorus mouse DPI. Not all of this will show, it does depend on the peripherals you're using. So it won't populate everything, depends on what you've got. And then if you go out of the menu, you'll see this now has some numbers. It can take a while to actually show the numbers, and I found that when I just activated it with the software running, and I activated this through the OSD, it didn't work. But if I selected dashboard here and just sort of toggled it on then off again, or off then on again, then it did start populating. So have a go with the actual software itself rather than the OSD control, just to try and get this up if you're having some issues. But you can see that some things just say 0, but other things do show some information. So that's all that little feature is for. And remember, this is an overlay, so if you're in a game or something else, you'll still be able to see all of this information. There's power off if I press down now, if I press the joystick in the down direction, that is. Alternatively, if you want to power the screen off, you can hold the joystick for a few seconds, and it will do that. And just press the joystick once inwards, and it will turn on again. And if I press up now when I'm in this little radial quick menu, I can go to the main menu. Before going through all of the settings here, I want to address the question, what are the best settings for this monitor? Now, by best settings, I mean the settings which I used as my test settings in the review, and I've used these because they fit my preferences, they work on my unit, and they work according to the targets which I go for within reason in my reviews. So remember that you will have your own individual preferences and individual units differ, so if these don't work for you, then feel free to make your own adjustments. The first thing is the preset itself. That is found in Picture. The most flexible ones, Custom 1, Custom 2 and Custom 3. Standard is a little bit less flexible because it greys out 6-axis colour. I'm sorry if this isn't clear in the video. The way they've done this is really blended, and actually it would be one of my complaints about this menu system, is it isn't as clear visually as it could have been. But standard is otherwise very similar to the custom ones if you set things up in the same way. I will quickly just go through the other presets. I'll just show you them. So there's FPS. This makes various different adjustments. It has a bright look to the image. It has a low gamma look, so it gives you lifted detail for dark shades, which can give you a competitive edge. But you can make manual adjustments which will achieve that kind of thing as well with the other presets. It just basically sets this up to different things by default. So you see the gamma is actually set to 1.8. So as I was saying, low gamma lifts up the shades, makes a lot of those darker shades brighter than they should be, for example. And it sets the color temperature to cool. That's just what it does. Don't know if that's advantageous in any way, but it's just what it does. RTS RPG, significantly warmer look to the image. I can see that straight away. Makes other adjustments. Brightness is set to 90 by default, for example. Contrast is raised slightly for no apparent reason. Gamma set to 2.0. You get the idea. That's really what these presets do. They just set things to different values, and you can change them and it will remember it for that preset. So if you want to customize them, you can do that. Reader setting is a low blue light setting of sorts. So it has a moderate brightness, slightly reduced contrast, slightly reduced color vibrance. Low blue light set to 5, which is a moderate level. sRGB, that is its own little preset. This is the sRGB emulation setting of the monitor, which clamps the gamut closer to sRGB. That's all explored in the review. You might want to use this if you do want to use an sRGB gamut clamp and you want to have things more as the developers intend within the sRGB color space, which most content is really designed for, and you don't want extra vibrancy and extra saturation, then you can have this used as your main preset. That's fine. It is explored fully in the written review, but you can see that you can adjust the brightness, which is nice, but you can't really adjust anything else. So, for example, you can't change the color channels and you can't change the gamma setting. So custom 1, that's what I'm using, but you can of course set the other presets such as custom 2, custom 3 or standard up in much the same way as I'm going to be showing you here. So what did I actually change? Well, the brightness, I reduced that to 30, and that got close to my 160 nit target, which I go for in my reviews. That's just what I've always gone for, and I go for that for consistency. It works in most of the lighting conditions that I go for, but this is something you would adjust according to your own preferences and lighting conditions. Contrast, I left that at 50, which is the default. I left a lot of this at the default, really. I did change color temperature, so yes, gamma is also default 2.2. Color temperature, user define 100, green was at 99, blue was at 100. Be careful when you're adjusting these. This didn't actually get 6500K on my unit, which I would usually go for my test settings. The reason for that is that on my unit at least, and this could well apply more broadly with the M27U, the precision with these adjustments really isn't very good. So if I reduced the blue channel just 1 to 99, it actually dropped my color temperature about 300K, which is a massive change for just a single point adjustment with the color channel. And it also affects the green balance. And I could rebalance everything. I could get 6500K and a good neutral green channel as well, but that would involve massive adjustments which would greatly affect the contrast. So I actually just settled for 100, 99 and 100. Again, it depends on your unit as to what will be optimal here. And there was, a slight grey neutrality issue, a little bit of green to some greys, but it wasn't extreme. If it was extreme, I probably would have made further adjustments, like I said, would be ideal, but that does, again, have an effect on contrast. The other setting to be aware of, well, there were a few, but the ones that I actually changed. So there's overdrive. I can't actually remember what that was set to by default. I think it might have actually been set to picture quality, but this would be what I would recommend in general if you're spending a lot of time, particularly at high refresh rates. But some people will find picture quality just fine for any refresh rate. But if you're spending a lot of time at low refresh rates, around 60 Hertz, for example, then you might find setting this to off as preferable just because it will reduce your overshoot, but it depends on your overshoot sensitivity. And some people might prefer the balance setting, which gives stronger overshoot. You might not prefer this at 60 Hertz necessarily, but at higher refresh rates, if you can tolerate a bit of overshoot and you want to speed the pixel transitions up just a little bit compared to picture quality, then the balance setting might suit. They're all explored in the review. AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, that is your adaptive sync toggle. So if you want to use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, you also have to have this enabled. If you want to use FreeSync, you have to have this enabled as well. But basically any VRR technology which relies on adaptive sync, you need to have this enabled. So I've shown you so far an adjustment I made to brightness, to the color channels, the overdrive setting I used, and AMD FreeSync Premium Pro being on in the OSD. The other thing I did was I set DP refresh rate to 160 Hz rather than the default of 150 Hz. Now this 10 Hz difference, it really makes very little difference in practice. It's not something I'd worry about. If for whatever reason your system doesn't run with 160 Hz, then I would just accept the 150 Hz, which may work if 160 doesn't. So that's why they set it to 150 by default. It did actually say there, if you notice flickering or flashing or some issues with 160 Hz, just use 150 Hz. What I would say though is when I first activated 160 Hz, I did get some screen blanking, so the screen went off for a while, then it sprung back to life, or briefly went off and sprung back to life. I got around this by simply reactivating NVIDIA G-Sync compatible mode in NVIDIA control panel, and I unselected enabled G-Sync compatible, pressed apply, and then checked that checkbox again so it was enabled, pressed apply, and that got rid of the issue for me. You might find that you need to toggle AMD FreeSync Premium Pro in the OSD if toggling it in the graphics driver doesn't work for you, and then that might just fix it up for you, and 160 Hz might just work fine. But if it's still giving you issues with screen blanking, just select 150 Hz. If you're using HDMI, then you are limited to 150 Hz maximum, even if you're using HDMI 2.1. I'm just going to enable HDR because the settings are very different under HDR. I didn't actually change anything under HDR. I left things as they were, except that I did ensure overdrive was set to picture quality, and it may be depending on the preset you're using anyway. And yes, I enabled adaptive sync, so AMD FreeSync Premium Pro was enabled. I prefer to use that versus not using it, and you can use that at the same time as HDR, that's not a problem. You'll see there are 3 different HDR presets. These are exactly the same if you configure them in the same way. The reason they've got 3 of them is because there are some settings which you can customize: dark enhance, color enhance, light enhance, local dimming. Sorry, that's all there is. And then the reset picture, which will just reset this to the factory defaults. So if you want 3 different sets of settings for different games or different application types, you can do that. I'm not really fussed about that or indeed these settings, but I will just briefly show you what they do. I'm just going to load up a game under HDR because it'll give you a better visual representation of what these settings do. So I've got Shadow of the Tomb Raider running under HDR now. If you do like a sharpness filter, by the way, you can up the super resolution setting. I'm not fussed about that, I leave that disabled. Just worth mentioning because I know some people do like a bit of extra sharpness under HDR, and some monitors do that anyway, so that's how you can control that if you wish. So the first thing I'm going to go through is local dimming. I would recommend setting this to high. The monitor doesn't have a lot of dimming zones. It only has 8 dimming zones running as vertical bands across the screen from left to right, but it still does give a perceived edge and contrast, and I do talk about this more in the review. If you have this set to high, then it gives you the strongest effect. It's most likely that the dimming zones will actually dim, so it gives you the strongest effect really. But you can have a play with this if you want a gentle effect. Some people, for consistency, they may just prefer having that set to off, because again there are only 8 dimming zones, so it's only going to do so much anyway, and in some scenes it could be potentially annoying. So set that according to your own preferences. Mine is to have this set to high. Dark enhance. This basically gives a very flooded look to things. You should be able to see that in the video, but it also gives more detail. So I can see more of the dark areas there, for example. So this kind of gives you a competitive edge. To me, this sort of detracts from the atmospheric look under HDR. Not that this monitor is particularly good in that respect anyway, but it's even worse with Dark Enhance enabled. There's Color Enhance, and this gives a bit of a saturation boost. It isn't a strong or extreme saturation boost, so you can have it set just a little bit more, or the strongest effect. But even with the strongest effect, level 3, I wouldn't say it's a huge boost, but definitely there is some oversaturation now. That gold looks sort of overdone. The reds there are a bit overdone as well. It doesn't do the same thing as a sort of digital saturation enhancement would, where it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. Anyway, I'm witching on a bit here, but basically if you want to use that setting, you can. I was just trying to say it has a little bit more of a subtle effect than you might expect in places. Light Enhance. You can see that really just brightens up the image. It doesn't change how bright the monitor will actually go. It's really a big gamma shift of sorts. It just makes things overly bright, over-brightened. And that also gives you an uplift to those darker shades. And it doesn't really give the same flooded look to the image, although it over-brightens things. It does maintain good depth, so it's a bit more selective in that respect, and I would prefer it to using Dark Enhance if you want that visibility enhancement. And then there's Reset Picture, and that's really all there is under HDR, and all there is in general for the best settings of the monitor. I'll now take a look at the remaining settings. Aim Stabilizer Sync, that is the strobe backlight setting of the monitor, which is explored in the written review. Black Equalizer, so I've got legom.nl, the website, open. The tests for black depth, or the black level test, sorry. So this is set to 10 by default. If you raise this, then it starts lifting shades up. It does affect your contrast as well, particularly at higher levels. So 20 is the strongest effect, but it lifts your black depth up, so you do lose contrast. So in that respect, this setting isn't as well tuned as some models, or as a similar feature on some models, I should say. It's not as selective. It lifts up a lot of shades, including black, but it mainly focuses on your darker to medium shades, not so much the brighter shades. So if you want a bit of a competitive edge, consider that. You should also consider just lowering the gamma setting as well. Try that. In fact, I'll just quickly show you that now. I kind of mentioned this in the best settings section, but I only mentioned that I left it at 2.2 because that worked on my unit. 1.8 will give you a bit of an uplift. 2.0 a bit less of an uplift if you want things to look more crushed together. A deeper look overall, then 2.4, 2.6 may be preferred for you. Back to the black equalizer setting, if you reduce this, then it gives extra depth, it crushes things together. You can't see a lot of the darker shades now. Be aware that what you can see on the video is not what you'd see by eye, but it does give you an idea of the relative effect of this setting anyway. So yeah, it's an okay setting if you need to use it or you want to use it, but isn't as well configured as some. Super resolution. That's a sharpness enhancement feature which over sharpens the image. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Ever increasing effect, or 0, which is disabled. This may be useful if you're looking at lower resolution content or you're running the screen at non-native resolution, for example. But there is also a sharpness control which has a different effect, a different sharpness filter, and you can increase that if you prefer. So this monitor gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of its sharpness because it has both this conventional sharpness control, and you can soften the image as well if you prefer, by the way. So 5 is the correct neutral point, or the default neutral point, and that's my preference. But you can change that, you can change super resolution as well according to your preferences. Overdrive, which I've been through, and AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, which I've been through. Display mode, I haven't been through, that's grayed out unless you're running the monitor at a non-native resolution. So I'm just going to switch over now to 2560 by 1440, 144 Hz, and you'll notice that display mode is grayed out still. I believe that is because I have AMD FreeSync Premium Pro enabled. You have to have that disabled to use the scaling settings of the monitor, to adjust the scaling settings, I should say. As explored in the interpolation and upscaling section, it will use interpolation either way. And I can now access display mode, and I'm just going to set it back to the native resolution because I'm just going to check that this is available, because it's not actually the resolution that matters. I think it's just the AMD FreeSync Premium Pro setting. So yes, it was just the fact that I had AMD FreeSync Premium Pro enabled in the OSD, and these are in fact available for the native resolution as I'm running now. So there's full, that uses all the pixels of the screen to fill up the image. Aspect, which will look at the aspect ratio of the source resolution and stick to that whilst using as many pixels as possible to fill up the screen. There's 1:1, which will use only the pixels called for in the source resolution. I'll just quickly show you some examples of this. So the QHD resolution. So there's a big black border, it's only using 2560 by 1440 pixels. If you select the full HD resolution, then it's going to be using fewer pixels, so it's going to be an even smaller image on the screen, but it's completely undistorted, only 1920 by 1080 pixels. Yes, that is how much of a difference there is comparing the full HD resolution to the UHD resolution. Quite something when you see it like this. And there are a few settings which will simulate different aspect ratios. So there's 22-inch wide 16 by 9, so aspect ratios and screen sizes they're simulating here. Sorry, it's actually 22-inch 16 by 10. There's 23-inch 16 by 9, and there's 24-inch 16 by 9. Next is picture, and I've gone through all of these presets. Next is display. You can select the input used by the monitor, DP refresh rate, which I mentioned before, a few grayed out settings which you probably can't see on the video, but there's RGB range and overscan. So RGB range allows you to select a full range or limited range signal if you're using HDMI. Most people will want to be using the full range signal, but if you want to enforce a limited range signal, then you can. And if I recall correctly, there is an automatic setting as well, which I think is the default setting anyway, and that should look at the signal type that the source wants to use and then set the monitor appropriately. So that's probably the setting which most people will just want to leave it on anyway. Overscan, and that applies to certain resolution, system, whatever combinations. It's not something which most people will be able to access or want to use anyway. It causes the image to run off the screen, and yes, it's not something that you can enforce, for example, when you're just using the native resolution. Apply picture mode. So this allows you to select whether you want to have different picture settings for your preset configuration for all inputs or just the current input. So if you had different systems connected via, say, HDMI and DisplayPort, then you can have separate settings if you wish for each system, and they'll be remembered for that input. Next, you've got PIP, P by P, picture in picture, picture by picture. I'll go through briefly. I don't have more than one source connected as usual, so I'll just show you what this would do. So PIP, source. This will give you a secondary source there in that black box, and your primary source for the rest of the image. You can change the size of that secondary source box as well. So there's a small, medium and large, the location of the box, display switch if you want to switch the primary and secondary sources around, and audio switch so you can select which source you want to use for the audio, main or subsource. There's also picture by picture, so that will give you a side-by-side view, primary and secondary sources. You can select full or aspect depending on what kind of scaling you want to use for the picture-by-picture display. Display switch, you can switch the primary and secondary sources around, and the same with audio switch like I showed you with PIP. Next, you've got system audio settings. You can change the volume of the integrated speakers or something connected to the 3.5mm jack if you're using that, or you can mute the sound source. A few OSD settings. You can change how long the OSD is displayed before it automatically disappears. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 and 30 seconds. You can change the transparency effect or apply transparency effect. If you really want to be able to struggle to see things, you can have it set like that. Beautiful. OSD lock, so you won't be able to accidentally press the OSD, I guess. But then if you try and press a button, it just says the button is locked, confirm to unlock OSD. So it has a very simple unlock procedure, unlike some monitors. You can change the size of the OSD. I probably should have set it to 2x before starting the video. I didn't realize you could actually do that. I do apologize. Well, you live and learn. I'll just leave it at 2x for the rest of the video. Why not? I'll try and remember this for next time I'm reviewing a 4K UHD Gigabyte monitor, which is reasonably small. OSD pivot, which just allows you to pivot the OSD if you're using the screen in portrait. That would make sense. This monitor doesn't actually go in portrait with the included stand, but you might be using it in portrait by using a different stand or mount. Quick switch, which I showed you, that your shortcuts can change what it does with up, down, left and right before you enter the OSD. Other settings, resolution notice, if you want it to give you a little note on the screen to just bug you if you're not using the native resolution, to remind you that you're not using the native resolution. You can have the auto switch for the inputs active or deactivated. Auto power off, which will turn the monitor off after a given amount of time, I believe. I just checked the manual and it seems to agree with that explanation, so I'm just going to go with that. So it'll just turn the monitor off after a given amount of time, up to half an hour. If you want the monitor on for longer, but want it to automatically turn off, tough. LED indicator, that's the little white LED there at the bottom right. Always on, always off, or just on during standby. There's a Type-C compatibility mode, so if you're finding that your devices aren't connecting by Type-C, it might be because it's trying to use too much bandwidth or something like that, so you can have that set to on. You can enforce HDMI 2.0 if you need to for compatibility reasons, or have it set to 2.1. You can have HDMI CEC enabled or disabled. This is something which you usually find on TVs but not monitors. And it's not something which I really have experience with, to be honest, but it is a feature of this monitor which you can enable if you wish. You can have it set to charge using the USB ports, or you can have that disabled. And the fact it says auto and disable rather than enable and disable, I am not sure. I haven't tested this, but I believe it might detect that you don't have anything connected and disable the charge feature, because on some monitors it will use a little bit more standby power if you have this enabled versus disabled, even if you don't have anything connected. Not sure what happens in this case. It isn't something I test. There's language, so you can change the language the OSD is displayed in, various different options there. Save settings, so you can save all of the settings in the OSD to setting 1, 2 and 3, and just quickly save and reload. These have nothing to do with the custom 1, custom 2 and custom 3 presets, by the way, completely separate thing. And there's reset all, which will reset everything to the factory defaults. I'm now going to go through Gigabyte Control Center, and you can find a link to download that in the description of the video. You can also use OSD Sidekick if you already have that installed or you want to use that. When you first enable this, or when you first open this, it says no device finded. Yes, perfect English there. But just press OK, and give it a little bit of time and it should eventually find the monitor. I don't know why it takes a while, and I don't know why it says nothing is found or no device finded at the start there, but it will eventually get there. And if you have it minimized or you leave the application open, you shouldn't have to go through this waiting if you want to use the software, but it is a bit cruddy to have seen that, to be honest. It would have been better if it was instantaneous either way. But there we go, now it shows a little monitor there, Sidekick and Update Center. So if you want to update stuff, no available updates, you can just press Update Center. Sidekick. So this is similar, or the same actually, the same functionality I believe as OSD Sidekick, if you're using OSD Sidekick. So you can change the input used by the monitor, LED indicator, which I showed you before, so it must be on, off, and on during standby. They call it friendly here. It's a bit strange. Don't know why it's unfriendly if you don't have that setting enabled. You can control the picture in picture by picture here, and you can customize it in the same way as you can in the OSD. I'm sorry this is really difficult to see in the video. Again, Gigabyte have gone for this ridiculously blended look to everything. So except for the thing that's actually selected, it's kind of difficult to see things. So I do apologise about that. You can change the quick switch. You can change what is up, down, left and right before you've entered the main menu system. You can change the opacity of the display and the display time, so the timeout period, just like I showed you in the OSD. Active noise cancelling, that's not a feature on this monitor. It doesn't have its own integrated microphones to do that with. That's a feature of some Aorus models. And next there's display settings, so various different things there. You can change the preset used by the monitor, and you can customize different settings. So yes, it's not super fast. A bit more please wait going on. A bit more please wait going on than I'd like, in fact. But you can see you can change various things here. Not every single setting, but a lot of the settings. It says color temperature cool because it only has cool, normal and warm listed. Although you will notice that I actually have it set to user define, or you will remember, or you should remember, if you've been paying attention, that I've got it set to user define. But it doesn't have a user define option here, so it just says cool, and you can't change the red, green and blue color channels manually here, which is a bit of a pain if you want to be doing that anyway. You have 6-axis color control, and I've just realised I didn't go through that. I wonder if there's something else Yeah, so I've just noticed there are actually a few settings which I didn't go through in the OSD, but I will go through them now. So the first one is color vibrance, and that is a saturation adjustment, so you can have things completely monochrome if you want, a bit less saturated. If you want things to be oversaturated, which will pull shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself, so it crushes shades, it makes things look rather cartoonish. If you prefer that look, then you can do that. And the 6-axis control for saturation and hue, so that allows you to have finer control over the saturation levels. If you just found red a bit overbearing, then you can adjust that. For some reason it sets it to 100 a piece if you try to adjust this. I don't know why it's done that. So it supremely oversaturates things by default. I'm just going to close Gigabyte Control Center to see what the heck's going on here. So yes, these should be set to 50 by default, not 100, so the software sort of messed this up. Okay, so I was playing around with red and it set everything to 100 when it shouldn't have. So that should have been set to 50, and that explains things. Okay, let's try that again. So I completely closed it because, here we go again. No device finded. Yes, so I completely closed it because I wanted to just get rid of any interaction with Gigabyte Control Center and the OSD, because generally you want to be just using one or the other, not both at the same time, or it can cause some weird confusion or conflicts. Here we go, we're back in action. You'll see that this is actually grayed out, the 6-axis control here, which to be honest is better given what it did before, but I think if I change presets to something else, it's still grayed out. Interesting, I'm not sure what it's doing here. So yes, it's a little bit janky, a little bit buggy, this software. Okay, it's available now, and it says they're all at 100, but they're not, they're all at 50. So I'm not going to touch this, I've kind of gone through what it does, but there's red, green, blue, cyan, magenta and yellow. You can control the saturation levels. I would recommend doing it in the OSD though, because this seems to just be messed up. Unless you remember that 50 is actually the default rather than 100, maybe that will work. But you can also adjust hue, and I'm just going to do that in the OSD, because I fear doing any of this using Sidekick. So in the menu, it's 6-axis color, saturation, hue, saturation, hue, saturation, hue, saturation, hue. You get the idea. What I would say, as I usually say, is for most people, hue isn't something that you'll want to touch. Saturation, you may want to fine tune according to preferences, but it can be difficult to get things right, the balance. You'll find that some shades look a bit undersaturated when you start reducing this, and others remain too saturated. Even if you're just reducing the red, you'll find that some red shades or red bias shades can look quite fiery, other ones not so much. It can be very difficult to get the balance right. But if you want to just make slight adjustments, you can do that. And the same with hue. So hue just shifts things, can make things look really pink and funky if you want. Or I can make things look very green and yellow, or greenish yellow. And this is just the red hue. Of course, you can adjust the green hue and all of the others as well. But you get the idea, just for a bit of fine-tuning of the hue if that's something you want to do. I'm a poet and I didn't know it. Another setting which shouldn't really be here but is local dimming, on or off. This is only relevant for HDR, but it doesn't seem to have different settings like I showed you in the OSD. There are different levels of local dimming on this monitor. It looks like you can enable it in SDR by using this toggle, but you can't. It doesn't actually do that. So just ignore that unless you're using HDR, and I'd really recommend just making sure it's doing the right thing by doing it in the OSD rather than with this software. FreeSync, enable or disable that, so enable or disable adaptive sync. App info, so you can have different applications using different presets. The top thing there, which is grayed out, just says OSD pivot, but that's not a feature of this monitor, so it would automatically adjust the orientation of the display when you pivot the monitor into portrait. The stand doesn't even have portrait orientation, so it's not something which this monitor offers. So yes, different picture modes for different presets, that's what this does. Gaming assistant, which I showed you before, I showed you the custom crosshairs, I showed you the dashboard functionality, and I've shown you this in the OSD, but this allows you to activate and deactivate aim stabilizer, or aim stabilizer sync in this case. You can also have the refresh rate displayed, and be aware that that is twice as big as what I was showing you before. That's because I've got my OSD set to 2x, so it doesn't just change the OSD. Everything related to the OSD, like the FPS display, for example, that's also doubled. And this should be 160 Hz rather than 144. I didn't even realize I was running the monitor 144 Hz. I was just playing around with that before, so I'll change that back. Not that this actually matters for the sake of this video, but you know, just makes me feel better. And there's a gaming timer feature and the counter. You can also assign hotkeys to different functions. So if you want to increase and decrease the monitor brightness using hotkeys, you can do that here. So I can have Alt and 0 or whatever you want. So you press the little pen icon to edit these. Various different options there, and these will work when you're in game as well, so you don't have to have application focus on Gigabyte Control Center to use these little shortcuts. You can see there are various different options though: brightness, contrast, black equalizer. You can just read them here. Quite a few different options. Something I've realized though, the gaming counter feature is just supposed to count when you press certain keys. I don't know where you actually configure that. On OSD Sidekick, I'm pretty sure there was a little thing next to it that let you configure what will actually cause this to count up, because it doesn't know. So I don't know where you configure that, or if you configure that. Maybe I'm missing something. Never mind. And then finally there's KVM switch, which just allows you to adjust what display input will be assigned for your USB-B and which is assigned for USB-C. And that's all there is to the Sidekick section of Gigabyte Control Center, and all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Gigabyte M27U. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.